Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. I've got another technique of the week for you today. What I'm going to be working on is glazing techniques on this large painting. I'm just working on the background right now. It's going to be more than just clouds. I'm going to have some landscape stuff up here, and I'll probably show you guys that later on down the road. But for today I want to show you how I do some glazing techniques to adjust values to make clouds look a little more luminous and to create some depth. So what I'm going to do is, this is dry, all of these layers that are on here right now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to oil in to the painting. I'm going to talk about the mediums that I use for glazing. And then I'm going to do some glazing techniques to show you this week. So a lot of times what I'm trying to shoot for is to get my clouds to kind of like a mid-tone range. So I try to figure out where my lights are going to be and where my darks are going to be, and then I slowly push them in both ways. So I push the lights lighter, I push the darks darker, creating more depth and luminosity, especially in the lights. So I do that by glazing with oil paint. And this is an oil painting, by the way. And I'm just going to zoom in and show you how I do that. So you can use a couple different mediums, so you don't have to use the mediums I use today, but I'll talk about that here in just a second. All right, so I'm going to start by glazing in over these areas here, the lighter areas, to bring up the lighter values a little bit. And I like to work slowly. I like to do these layers really slowly, so that way each thin layer has a nice transparency to it. The underneath layers show through, and what that does is it creates a lot of soft edges and it builds up the light very slowly, so there's almost textured values within the bright area, if that makes sense. So rather than just pure white, the white actually has slight variations in values. Anyway, so what I'm using today, I just started using these, but it's just a basic concept with oil painting. I'm using Chelsea Classical Studios fat and lean medium. So with oil painting, there's an approach called fat over lean, where you use paint with more oil over paint that has less oil in it, lean paint. So I use lean medium to create all of these layers here, and now I'm switching to the fat medium. I'm going to oil in actually with this medium, which is basically cold pressed linseed oil mixed with some lavender Damar varnish. And what I'm going to do is glaze in, or I'm going to oil in, then glaze in over those sections. So just briefly again, fat over lean is basically, lean would mean you would have less oil and maybe more odorless mineral spirits mixed in with your paint, and that will help make it dry faster. And then the fat medium will have more oil in it, and that will make the paint dry a little bit slower. So what happens is the underneath layers dry first and the top layers dry second, so that way you don't get weird shrinkage and cracking in your paint. All right, so besides going beyond that, like, I mean, you can use different mediums to do all these types of things, but these are the mediums I'm using. I'm just using the fat over lean approach. So I'm going to use the fat medium. I'm going to oil in here, and then I'll show you some glazing techniques. Okay, for oiling in, I like to take a dry, soft bristle brush. You could also use like a makeup sponge. That's very common. People use that to oil in. And then I've got a little cup here with just a tiny bit of my fat medium. You really don't need a whole lot when oiling in. So just a little bit on the brush, and then I'm going to spread it around, mostly in the areas that I plan on painting. Again, I want to keep it relatively thin here and just kind of push that small amount of medium as far as I can go, because if you put too much of your medium up here, it'll dry really slow, and you can kind of get, usually cold pressed linseed oil shouldn't yellow too much, but if you were to leave linseed oil up on the painting, especially in white areas, and there was a lot of it, it would actually turn pretty yellow. So we want to make sure that we're oiling in and then covering that oil with paint. So again, very small amounts and just really pushing it. And again, this painting's really dry. All right, so you get the picture here, really thin layer of your medium. And then we will start glazing. All right, so I'm going to be using flake white replacement, which is basically flake white but without the lead in it. And I'm going to be using a small round brush and then a large dry blending brush. So you want this to be really dry with soft bristles. So I'm only using white. I'm not using any other colors here. I like to, when I get to the glazing point, like to use just white and allow the very, very thin layers to be kind of transparent. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you here, barely any paint on the brush, just a little bit. That might even be a little too much. So when glazing, what we're trying to do is find an area that we want to brighten. So for clouds, these brighter areas kind of have a lot of slight variations in them which make them look textured. So what I like to do is find a contour, put in some light color around it. You can see a super, super thin layer. And then to soften everything up, just a couple quick brush strokes to soften any edges that might happen when you're glazing. So I created this contour right here. Let's push that up a little bit more. So I'm not eliminating all those little dark things, just adding in some brightness, defining this contour edge here. And then a quick little brush back and forth. So a very kind of tedious process with glazing. Glazing's all about thin layers and allowing transparencies or translucency, whatever you want to call it, to happen. So we're letting some of the darker colors show through to create textures. And we're just generally highlighting this area, leaving little darks here and there, and then lightly brushing over to soften everything up. So now, as I create this bright area, this part gets darker. So I want to bring that up a little bit. So again, glazing. A lot of these cumulus type clouds have darker edges and brighter spots within the center area. So that's what creates that really cool, powerful look. So we'll go into that center area with a little thin layer of paint, push it out towards that dark edge, even overlap it a little bit, because like I was talking about before, the paint is so thin that it causes the underneath layers to show through. So then you brush that off. And then we go back again. So we can go into that same area. If it's not bright enough, we can go into that same area and do another glazing layer. So all that oiling in makes for a really nice, smooth, slippery surface. So as I'm adding the paint on here, it goes on nice and smooth, and it's easy to move around. And like I mentioned a few times now, it creates that transparent or semi-transparent layer. All right, so you can see keeps the cloud really textured because we have all of these random little dark pieces showing through. And basically it's a process of pushing the lights further and further. And I'm not changing the color on my brush. I'm just using thin layers. So anytime I want to brighten an area, I just go over it again with another thin layer And as those layers build up, you get that illuminated look to the cloud, and without it being just pure white brush strokes. You get little faint areas of darkness showing through, which create the textures and make the clouds a lot more realistic. So again, with this glazing technique, we oiled in first. We find areas that we want to brighten. We go really thin with our layer, add in that brighter area, brush it out with a blending brush really lightly, and then continue that method over and over until we get the value that we want to get to. So you can really literally spend hours and hours glazing, and honestly, the more time you take and the more glazing you do, the more realistic your painting is going to be. You're just going to get lots of soft edges, and you get so many interesting things going with the dark showing through the lights. So this is, you know, a relatively advanced type of painting to get all of these subtle little values, but what I wanted to show you is just how to like build up the lights really slowly. A lot of times I see when people do skies and clouds that they go right for the brightness right in the beginning, and to me you're going to lose a lot of texture and a lot of that realistic look when you go too bright too quickly. All right, one more little layer here and then I'll move on to the darks. So again, anytime you want to find a little light spot, if you're following a reference photo, always go to the midtones first and then push the brights later. And again, the quick brush with the blending brush softens edges, so that way you get that more realistic look. Soft edges are always really important, especially when you're trying to create something that looks a little more realistic. If you look in nature, it's really hard to find hard edges anywhere, really. Our eyes blur a lot of things out, especially if we don't have perfect vision. So when you paint really hard edges, sometimes it takes away from the realism. So that quick little brush stroke softens everything up with oil paint. Acrylic paint's a little different approach. All right, so I want to kind of darken some of these clouds here, especially by the white, just so I can get some nice contrast. So again, we're just oiling in first. So I'll do this cloud here. And even when you oil in, you can see that it changes the value of the cloud. And that will happen as well when you varnish. So something to keep in mind as you go through a painting, as you get towards the end, if things look not contrasty enough for you, once you varnish it, it might change it. You just kind of have to get used to how that changes the more you paint. So let's darken up one of these clouds here. I'm going to use that same brush. All right, so I'm using a combination of ultramarine blue, raw umber, and alizarin crimson to create the dark cloud. And so you can see much darker than what we have up here right now. But what I want to do is just put some paint on here, allow the oil to kind of move it around. And just like we did before, we're taking that large blending brush and wiping out all the hard edges. So making sure it's nice and smooth and then nice and even. Okay, so as I come out here, I want to follow my shape. Maybe a few little break off areas. And then with that blending brush, nice and dry, brushing up and down, softening all the edges. So for this painting, I want a variety of dark values. So I want some clouds to kind of look like they're standing out a little bit more, a little more prominent, and then some to be a little, a little more faded, like in the middle ground. So I'm not going to go to all of these clouds and darken. What I want to try to do is find certain ones that I want to have pop out into the foreground a little bit more. So basically just a glazing over the shapes that I already have, and then maybe adding in a few little extra pieces here and there, and then softening the edge. And it's really easy to soften everything, especially with all the oil already on the canvas. Okay, and maybe I wanted to do something a little more mid-tone. So just adding white to that color I'm using. Maybe I want this one to feel a little bit lighter. But I still want all those nice little break off areas. So I'm just going glazing over that section, that cloud, changing the value a little bit, and then softening it up. Can do it even with these little wispy clouds. All right, so that's how I glaze in layers to bring up the brights and darken the darks in some of these later stage cloud paintings. Like I said, I'm going to have more to this painting than just clouds, but I wanted to really, start pushing the values a little bit, and I wanted to show you guys how I do that and how I do it really slowly. And the more you kind of take your time and build those values up, the more realistic it looks, and the more depth you'll create in the clouds as well. So if you have any questions, make sure you post those in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this week's Technique of the Week on glazing. Hope you check out my website, timgagnon.com. I have hundreds of online painting lessons in oil and acrylic, lots of subject matter. So please check that out if you get a chance, and make sure you subscribe and like the channel. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I'll be back next week with another Technique of the Week.